Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice-monthly podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, get people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton, and I am going to remember this week to tell you that I work for Illinois Indiana Sea Grant at Purdue University. And I'm joined today by my good friend and co-host, Megan Gunn. Megan, how are you?
I'm doing really good, Stuart. How are you doing?
I'm also doing good. I'm feeling fired up. We had a nice 80-degree day yesterday, the last one for the year, but I experienced sweat, which I enjoyed, and now it is thundering and perhaps raining, and we're headed, of course, to the inevitable decline of the weather towards winter, but I'm not going to talk about that because instead, what I'm going to talk about is it is almost election time, and I am not a political junkie, but I have been following the election with interest, I think, because this is a high relevance time, I think, for folks. How about you? You fired up about the election?
I voted the other day, so I guess I
voted?
was fired up, and now I feel kind of just calm about everything.
Nice. I was going to go vote at the arena. The I think it's called, is it called Mackey? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, the basketball.
Yeah, the basketball thing. And they had early voting. And so I was all fired up. And then somebody told me he waited in line for 3 hours to vote. And I said, you know what? My polling place opens at 6 in the morning on election day. My kids wake up at 5. I'll be okay. Anyway.
I had a 10-minute wait, so you may want to try over on this side of town.
10-minute wait over on that side. Yeah, but then I have to get on my bike or drive. Or whatever. I think I've forgotten how to drive. It's been so long since I've done it regularly at this point. I'm slowly regressing. Anyway, all right, good. So our guest, I'm really excited to talk to our guest, though. So it's election relevant, right? We wanted to keep it Great Lakes focused, but be very topical because that's, a key thing for us is topical. So we're excited. We have an assistant professor of political science with us. So let's actually just play some interstitial music and then get going with it. How about this one today? Our guest today is Dr. Chris Devine. He is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Dayton in the Great Lakes state of Ohio. And he does a lot of work into sort of politics in the area and vice presidents, actually, of all things, and stuff like that. And so we're really excited to talk to him. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to join you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So let's talk about the Midwest kind of as a battleground. You'll hear that a lot about Great Lakes states specifically and Midwest more generally. They're battleground states. What does that mean precisely?
Sure. And so I have to start off by mentioning the research that I think tied me into this podcast is that I wrote a book chapter on the Midwest really as a battleground that was part of a book published by the University Press of Kansas. It's called The Conservative Heartland. John Locke and Kathy McNichol-Stock are the editors on that. And my co-author on this chapter was my colleague Dan Birdsong at the University of Dayton. And I mentioned that. I want to make sure I give him credit. Also, Dan is really, he has this passion, especially for answering your question here. What is a battleground? And we often have discussions of this, and he could probably describe it better than I did. But to try to give us a succinct answer to this, battleground is actually a term that comes from, it's a military term applied to politics. It's not new that we think of politics in war terms sometimes. Even a campaign, right? That also comes from.
Yeah, true. The language of politics is really violent, isn't it?
It is. It actually is. Frighteningly so, yes. And sometimes appropriately so. I don't know. But yeah, a battleground, it's contested ground. It's something that could be up for grabs. When we think of the Electoral College, obviously the presidency is determined not by who wins the most votes overall. Otherwise, we'd have President Clinton right now. Instead, it's about who wins the most votes in the Electoral College. Almost every state, except for pesky Maine and Nebraska, give all of their votes to whoever wins the most votes in the state. They have a little different of a system. So most of the time, if you want those 18 electoral votes from Ohio or 16 from Michigan or whatever it might be, as long as you get one more vote than the other person, you get all of them. As we had so many close ones, for instance, in 2016, Michigan being decided by 0.2%. So that was a battleground and surely will be again this time.
So is the Midwest have like an unusual concentration of battleground states then? Is that why there seems like a big focus on it? Or is it just feel that way because I live here now?
It is unusual. That's really what this whole book chapter is about, is kind of, really saying that clearly and presenting some evidence to show it, that this is not a new phenomenon, that the Midwest has been the central battleground in the Electoral College. We show that going back into the 1800s, for instance, by a variety of measures. In recent years, you look at where the candidates go, they go by far more to Midwest than to the rest of the country, to other regions. In fact, we titled the chapter "Fly to Country," right, rather than fly over when it comes to campaigns. It's where they're flying to. We see that in this campaign as well. Just to give an example, my favorite example, my state of Ohio in 2012 got 30% of all campaign visits for the entire country, one state.
No kidding.
Yeah, wow. It wasn't number one in 2016 and surely won't be in 2020 either, but it's always up there towards the top. So is the Midwest a major battleground? Yes, in terms of where the candidates are going to. If we track that back to even how often they're mentioned as battlegrounds in newspaper coverage, media coverage. Dan Birdsong took the lead on this one, created a brilliant new measure of even determining, how the media are covering states as battleground states. Midwestern states is a percentage of all states called battlegrounds in media coverage, going back several decades. The Midwest is far ahead of any other region in that regard as well. So by a number of different metrics, some new ones that we present here, some new data to document what I think most of us know, especially if we live in the Midwest. Yes, it's true. The Midwest is a battleground to a greater extent than any other region of the country, and that's typically the way it is.
So, but I think of I feel like we're in times of migration right now, right?
Yep.
Where at least a lot of the population is moving out of the Midwest and concentrating on the coast. Maybe, is that accurate? I'm not sure. Or concentrating within the cities along the Midwest. So is that traditional battleground status something that you expect to see continuing going forward, or is it unclear at this point?
So great observation there. It's true. We have population shifts, and that's going to influence to what extent certain areas are battlegrounds. For instance, southern states seem to be becoming more battlegrounds, especially Georgia, Texas. We'll see where it lands this time around. But some southern states are becoming much more competitive than they used to be. In part, it's hard, the various dynamics. But because some folks, especially from, let's say, the Northeast and Midwest, are moving down to those areas. And oftentimes these are more college-educated folks who may be going down to the South for new job opportunities. They typically are moving to metro areas. It's Houston, it's Atlanta, and so on. And a recent divide we see in politics, didn't used to be this way, really 2016 was the flashpoint for this, is we're starting to see a major divide in partisan preferences between folks who do and do not have a college degree. So those without tend to be going more towards Donald Trump overall, at least Republican candidates, and those with more towards Democratic candidates. So that's just one example of how, yes, migration can shift the competitiveness of states as the Midwest loses population in relative terms over time. That may be one reason why we're seeing fluctuations in competitiveness, where, even in a state like Ohio that used to be more competitive, at least the last time around was not so much so. And then we have other states like Minnesota or Michigan that for decades have not really been contested, at least haven't ended up close. Were close at least last time around, and probably will be this time.
And of course, in the super long run, we're all dead, as John Maynard Keynes allegedly said. But thinking about how population patterns aren't static, right? And they don't stay the same. I mean, you look at some of the climate projections, for example, and it's expected that, people might even start moving back toward this area of the country as other areas become less inhabitable. Maybe not, that might not be our lifetime, or at least not the next phase of our lifetime. But I guess you might expect to see that again, huh?
Yeah, it's possible. I'm not sure if where people would shift if, I don't know, they're coming from Florida or Louisiana or whatever. Do they necessarily come to the Midwest? Do they go to the West? Mountain West, for instance, or that's hard to project. But I'm sure we'll see some changes in migration patterns, and that could change. Whether it's people coming into the Midwest or people leaving it, we'll probably see changes in the future that could affect the political map.
And stupid question here, but as the population changes, the number of electoral votes change as well over time, right? Is that tied to the census, or how? What's the mechanism?
Yes, it is. So based on the census, so we start off with every state gets 2 Senate seats, and then there are 435 House representatives to go around. It's not how it originally was, but for the past 100 years, by law, that's the cap. And so the question every 10 years after a census is, how has the population shifted around? at least in relative terms. For instance, Ohio had lost population leading up to the 2010 census, and so it lost 2 seats in the House of Representatives. So it used to have 20 electoral votes, now it's 18. Probably we're going to lose another one, unfortunately, in this next round. So we'll be down to 15 House seats. You add the 2 Senate seats, that's 17 electoral votes. So yes, it's based on, since the House of Representatives is based on population and electoral votes represent the Senate plus House seats for every state, that will affect Ohio and Indiana or potentially Indiana, other states around the Midwest as well.
Interesting.
And so with a theoretical, there's talk of potentially adding additional states in the form of Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C., or I just read about this. We'll talk about this with our other guest, maybe splitting off the Upper Peninsula into its own state. Apparently they want to secede, so I'm excited to read about that. But so then that same 435 would get divided up more ways potentially.
Yeah, that's right. It's possible. The Constitution doesn't mandate that there be 435 seats. It does mandate 2 Senate seats per state, and that the Electoral College formula be House plus Senate seats. So if the law, not the Constitution, it's not in the Constitution, but if the law were changed so that it could be either we stick with 435 seats and now we shift that around, adding in Puerto Rico or whatever states may come in, or that number is raised. Gotcha. So the other states don't necessarily have to adjust. It gets complicated, right?
It is.
Electoral calculus is maybe pretty accurate. Yep. Well, let's talk a little bit. So you've done a lot of research on vice presidents, which I think is an interesting topic to research. I will look up the famous quote. I won't say it because this is a family show about the value of the vice presidency. But I think
your research, right?
Spit. What is it? It's not
worth a warm bucket of spit.
Warm bucket of spit. Yes. That's the second time in the episode we just released yesterday. We used spit as a euphemism for something else in a Monty Python song. So, yes, it's not worth a warm bucket of spit. However, your research is much more valuable. So your research itself is more valuable than a vice presidency, supposedly. So how do you do vice presidency research? Are you like modeling or looking, doing qualitative stuff? What kind of research are you doing with that exactly?
So first, I have to defend the vice presidency, okay?
Okay, fair enough.
So that's the famous quote from John Nance Garner, FDR's first vice president. He had 4 of them. Or 3 of them, excuse me.
Maybe it's just FDR who was tough to work with, right?
Yeah. Maybe. And, John Nance Garner was coming from being Speaker of the House. He had presidential ambitions of his own. In comparison, the vice president didn't seem like much. The constitutional responsibilities of the vice president are pretty minimal. The main one really is breaking ties in the Senate if there's ever a tie vote, and there rarely are. Presiding over the Senate, but they rarely do, and of course taking over for the president if the president were to die or resign or something like that. In the last 40 or so years, really starting with the Carter administration, he reached an agreement when he selected Walter Mondale as his vice president to give more power to the vice president. It's a model that worked really well, and so presidents since then have stuck with that. They don't have to. There's no law requiring it, let alone constitutional provision. But they just tend to because it works to their advantage. So, in short, what does the vice president do these days? The vice president is a liaison in domestic and foreign affairs, so negotiating with Congress, as Joe Biden did on budget deals in the early 2010s. Look at Mike Pence leading the coronavirus task force and working with governors. They often serve as kind of, just under the president level ambassadors going around the world and maybe doing preliminary negotiations with foreign nations. So sorry, I just have to stick up.
No. So the vice presidency now has emerged into it. No, of course, I was just being flippant with that. But obviously the vice presidency is something with a lot of potential power and responsibility, even if it's not, directly constitutionally enabled or whatever. And so what do you do specifically with vice presidential type research?
Sure. So this book, this is with another co-author, Kyle Kopko of Elizabethtown College, and it's called Do Running Mates Matter? And it's really the first book that ever tackles this question, believe it or not, of what effect running mates have on the election. There are other ways, wants to deal with media coverage or selection, but do they actually move votes? We bring together a few different perspectives on this, different ways that they could influence the vote. And it is a quantitative research methodology that we use. In short, what we look at is, first of all, when the running mate is more popular or, for that matter, unpopular, is that shifting how everyone votes? Do we see large movement in voting percentages based on that? For the most part, we don't. For that matter, when a running mate suddenly gets more popular, it doesn't have a lasting effect on the presidential candidate. We also look at what we call targeted effects. and that deals with not necessarily appealing to the whole country, but is the running mate, the vice presidential selection, a good way to pick up votes among a certain group of voters? So is Kamala Harris going to add votes among women and among African Americans? Of course, the first one we can test based on previous evidence. The latter we can't test yet, but we'll see what comes out of 2020, just in terms of historical examples. But by and large, not much in the way of these targeted effects. What we do find is that there tends to be this indirect effect. Kind of makes sense when you think about it. People are not really voting for vice president. They may like that person or dislike that person, but ultimately the power disparity between those two folks only makes sense. You're going to choose the person you prefer for president, regardless of who that elects as vice president. But your sense of that choice, who this person is, like, okay, Trump versus Biden, what's their judgment? What's their leadership ability? What's their political ideology? What are their priorities? What's their administration going to look like? The choice of a running mate, when you have so many different people you could pick from, tells people a lot about the presidential candidate. So just for one quick example, one thing we show from 2008, simply because the data available that year lend themselves to this much better than any other year, we can show that the more people perceived Sarah Palin as being ready to be president if necessary, the better they thought of John McCain's judgment. Now, of course, a lot of that flipped around because there were more doubts than usual about Palin's readiness to be president. So basically, that perception that she wasn't ready, wasn't up to the job like she should be for a typical vice president, hurt perceptions of McCain's judgment, and that hurt his vote total. We can show that statistically in the book, and flip that around for Joe Biden, tended to be seen as more ready to be president if necessary. That enhanced perceptions of Barack Obama's judgment and added votes for him. We're talking at the margins, nothing dramatic. But yes, they matter electorally, just not really in the way we typically think of bringing in a certain group of voters or just, driving everyone's vote overall. It's more this indirect effect.
That sounds like it's some relatively complicated modeling potentially, because you're trying to tease out a little bit of causality there, I suppose, yes. which sounds like it's pretty hard to do. Have there been other vice presidents historically who have had, significant, really big kind of influences that you're able to find in terms of turning out votes or getting, reflecting well on their president, top of the ticket or whatever?
It's hard to say. I don't want to dodge here, but I have to say that the evidence is really the data you can use to investigate these things is limited. What I just described in 2008, there just happened to be surveys, even that were launched before Palin's selection, that asked really pointed things about perceptions of the running mate. Usually, you don't get a question in a survey that's like, does this person have good judgment? At best, right. You'll get one that asks, like, rate them on a scale from 0 to 100. What do you think of them? Sure. Which is kind of a rough measure. As it is, and you get to these causality issues. I should mention just quickly on that in terms of causality. How do you know the running mates driving things? One thing we can do is there are some surveys, 08, 12, and 16, these panel surveys where they go back to the same people over time over the course of the campaign and ask them, how are you going to vote? And at some point, at least, what do you think of the running mate? They also ask what groups you belong to in terms of social groups or political groups. So there we can actually see, for instance, just to give you one example, let's say take Mike Pence in 2016. We can see how evangelical Christians or conservatives or Midwesterners, for that matter, actually that's appropriate for this, right? We can see how they were planning to vote before his selection, and then see if a subsequent movement in their intentions on how they were going to vote was that driven by being evangelical or being conservative or being a Midwesterner, controlling for other factors. And so there's one where we can pretty confidently say, believe it or not, actually being evangelical or conservative or Midwestern, all three of those did not significantly, in a statistical sense, explain a movement toward the Trump ticket, toward the Republican ticket. And we often don't see those home state or regional effects.
That's really interesting in terms of, first of all, the panel surveys. That's great. As someone who does a fair amount of survey research, I follow kind of, you see these polls that pop up periodically and I get jealous because there's a lot of work being done in terms of how to do that. So that's awesome.
Because you're talking about Mike Pence and how everything kind of changed, especially Indiana perception after he was put onto the 2016 ticket. Is there typically a positive effect on the VP's home state once they're selected for a ticket? Or how does that work?
Believe it or not, there's not much of a home state effect. That is one of the things everybody knows about running mates, right? Is that, hey, if you want to pick up a certain state, you want to pick up, I don't know, Michigan, let's say, hey, Biden should have picked Gretchen Whitmer. You already got California in the bag. Why bother with Kamala Harris? Pick Gretchen Whitmer instead. You hear a lot of this talk during the campaign, and we're not the first to look into this, but our first book, Kyle Kopko and I, VP Advantage in 2016, was all on this home state effect. It's really the most in-depth treatment of that, again, using different methodologies. And what we show pretty consistently is there really is not a home state effect. The best evidence, if there's any of this, would be, it's not entirely clear, but maybe someone who comes from a smaller state, at least smaller in terms of population, there's probably a more coherent sense of identity in those states. Like it means something to be in Delaware, from Delaware, that could be distinctive, or maybe even Alaska in that case, where like that actually matters in a way that, no offense, but being from Ohio or Indiana, I don't know, that might not be as central to who people are, just because there are different parts of that state, different identities within that state.
Right. Your identity is a little more diffuse in those.
Yep.
So here's a question. I was doing research for this. Why is every vice president from Indiana? I mean, that's not actually true, but I looked. There have been about 12 vice presidents from the Great Lakes states, that not counting New York. New York is a Great Lakes state, but I didn't want to have to portion them out halfway to the Atlantic coast and and then 6 of those have been from Indiana. So is this because of the Midwest being such a battleground that even though you found that maybe there isn't that big effect, people still think there is, or maybe they used to think there is? Is it because of that, trying to win the battleground, or is there just something about Indiana that is a sponge into which people can throw their political aspirations or something? I don't know.
Just a lot of great people live in Indiana.
That's hard to argue with.
Just trying to get on your good side. A lot of that goes back to an earlier era. So, of course, we have Mike Pence now and Dan Quayle before him serving as vice president. Prior to that, if I'm getting this right, check me on this, I think last was Thomas Marshall under Woodrow Wilson. And there were some others before that, early 1900s, late 1800s. So,
let's see. Thomas Marshall. Sorry, you got me checking now. Thomas Marshall. Was under Wilson. Oh, you named that, didn't you? Wow, you're a nerd. Fairbanks. Did you know him?
Yeah, Fairbanks. He ran once and lost, and then ran with a different candidate. He ran with Teddy Roosevelt and won in 2004, and then he ran with Charles Evans Hughes in 1916 and lost.
There we go. Listen to you.
On both
Thomas
sides.
Andrews Hendricks. No relation to Jimmy, judging by his picture. Let's see. Oh boy, Schuyler Colfax Jr.
I actually don't know how you say it. I used to say Schuyler or Schuyler.
Schuyler? I don't know.
Yeah,
he
and
seems to have been the
he was
first one.
corrupt, so he didn't come back for a second term. They gave him the boot.
Anyway, but so, and then there may be more, and there's Illinois. We got your vice president covered, but so
well, let
got
me
distracted by that. I forgot what you were saying.
Yeah, I can jump back in on that actually because
sure.
I'm off track myself.
I distracted you. Is what you're saying politely. Right, I got you.
It's good trivia. I love good trivia. What can I say?
Yeah.
So if you look at those vice presidents who came from Indiana, most of them came from an era where the vice president really did not have much power. So this modern era, and there's actually good evidence to suggest it's not from us. Jody Baumgartner is another political scientist who really studies vice presidential selection. One thing he shows is that state competitiveness used to matter more in an earlier era. Experience matters more since about 1960. As vice presidents have become more powerful, the competitiveness or the size of their state in terms of electoral votes statistically does less to predict, does really nothing anymore to predict whether they're selected. And so in an earlier era when vice presidents weren't terribly consequential unless the president died, which happened more than anyway, in those earlier eras, yeah, I mean, picking a vice president, what does it do for you? At best, it helps you to win a state and maybe win the election. So there was more of an incentive back then. You pick someone from a battleground state. At that time, Indiana was one of the key battleground states. Ohio and New York, typically because they had more electoral votes, they were actually singled out for presidential nominations. So it was often hey, we have a vice presidential slot left over. How about Indiana? Let's work them in here. Or New Jersey was often competing for that.
Throw New Jersey a bone. Yeah, sure.
Yep.
That makes sense. And then speculating, and maybe not. So you talked a lot. It's interesting about how the vice presidency has evolved, right? And so this is pure speculation. I just thought of it, and we can edit it out if it doesn't work. But how do you think that might continue, like going forward in the next 100? How does the vice presidency look in 100 years that it doesn't now? Obviously, it will be a robot, and people have implanted. But I mean, forgetting all that, it'll be hooked up to the matrix. How do you think the position might change if like current trends continue, or what do you kind of forecast going in there?
There's been relative stability over the last, we're at nearly half century, really, of powerful vice presidents, ones that have an office directly in the West Wing, which I don't know if that seems like much, but it really is a big deal. They have frequent access. They're always there. They're allowed into high-level meetings. They get the intelligence briefings. They get one-on-one time with the president. There's often a lunchtime per week set up in some cases. That's been pretty stable for the last, again, nearly half century. There's some fluctuations in what they do. Some take on more specific tasks than others. So I guess the best I could say is that there seems to be not a steady increase in overall responsibility, some shifting in where they focus their energy. And some of that depends on, quirks of who's president and who's vice president, what they want to do and how they get along and all that kind of stuff. But I can't say I have any good reason to believe it's going to become much more powerful over time. It's possible we could see some of these things codified in law, that vice president would take on certain duties. As long as presidents are seeing it to their advantage to keep giving this responsibility to the vice president, I don't think there's really need for some intervention, legally speaking, or in terms of constitutional amendments. So I would anticipate that that probably vice presidents are going to continue to be this important governing partner, but in an informal sense, unless perhaps there's something about the job of being president that becomes infinitely more complex, and you just need someone to have official responsibility for this other duty. But honestly, often the response is to create a new department of government, a new agency, and give responsibility, at least formal responsibility, to a cabinet secretary.
For those of us that haven't already voted, going into election night, what should we be looking for? Or what are you specifically looking for?
There's so much going on with this; it's hard to nail it down to one or two things. I think it's important to make sure everyone knows going into it. And if you're following this closely, it's maybe old news, but just to be clear, it's unlikely that we're going to know the winner on election night. Part of that has to do with variation in state laws on when incoming ballots can be counted. Now, there are some states that allow ballots to be counted immediately as soon as they're received. I'm talking about if there's an early vote, an absentee vote, immediately counted. Some of them, at some period beforehand, a certain number of days before the election, they can start counting the votes. Some it starts at different points on election day or election night. So there are some states, including Pennsylvania, that they're going to get a ton. And of course, Pennsylvania probably is. If the election comes down to one state, it's probably Pennsylvania. That's how most estimates have it. I'm not saying it will, but if it did, that would probably be the state to watch. So some states like Pennsylvania, which may be critical, they can't start counting these ballots that have come in, through other means, not cast on election day. They can't start counting them until election day or election night. I forget exactly when they have it. I think it's when the polls close. I could be wrong. There will also be, depending on the state, some ballots that they have to be postmarked by election day, but they don't arrive until the day after, 2 days after, maybe 3 days after. So those will still be there to be counted. So depending on how close the overall race is, depending on how close a particular state is, especially if it's a decisive one, that's why it's hard to speak about election night.
Right.
Because while I'd like to think we'd have a quick resolution, whoever wins, that we'd at least agree on who won pretty quickly. Frankly, I think it's going to take some patience that we're not accustomed to. And I do fear how that's going to play into different narratives of what exactly has gone on. You might see something where the vote totals are looking a certain way on election night, and one candidate may seize on that and say, look, I won. And then totally legitimate votes that were cast in proper ways and are counted in proper ways come in a day or two or three later, or at least that they aren't added to the tally until that time later. And some people might try to portray that as somehow illegitimate when it's not. That's the thing that I really have most on my mind, frankly, going into election night. just beside the kind of battleground electoral map stuff.
So is this like December that we should be expecting to know who the actual winner is?
It's hard to say. It depends on whether they're legal disputes, which there very well may be. There is, according to federal law, there does have to be electoral vote. Electoral college has to meet in December. I forget the exact date. I want to say it's the 12th or 14th or somewhere in there. It's kind of mid-December. Where the Electoral College will vote, and that means in every state, the members of the Electoral College separately in their respective states are meeting to vote on the same day at the same time. Then those are transmitted to Congress, and the Vice President, appropriately enough, is the one who actually opens those envelopes, those seal certificates. This is one other constitutional role. They have to be able to count. So it's a high bar. So the Vice President opens them, and they're counted. That happens in early January.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question, and this, Stuart, feel free to edit it out.
No. Let's keep it in.
But there are a lot of people that are thinking about not voting because they don't see their vote counting, because it is like ultimately up to the Electoral College to decide who gets elected. So what would you have to say to those people?
I would say it depends on the state, but in most states, the electors are legally bound to vote for whoever wins the vote in that state. Okay. I can't say off the top of my head whether this is true in Indiana, for instance, or which states, but I believe it's 31 or 32 states now require their electors to vote in accordance with how the people of that state voted. So you are binding them, at least in most of these states. And it was actually disputed whether that was constitutional. It's not a matter of constitutional provision that they're bound in such a way. Obviously, this is varying by state, so there's some flexibility for states to make choices here. There was some question of whether a state could actually penalize an elector for not exercising their conscience, instead just following the will of the people. That was resolved last July, and the Supreme Court affirmed that, yes, states, if they want to, can bind their electors in that way.
Which makes sense because they're representing that state, and I'll let that be.
Real-time fact check. Indiana does not bind the electors. There we go, which is very Indiana.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Chris, this is actually really interesting. I always say that, and I'm usually lying, but this time I'm not lying.
Is that going on air? Is that going to make it a podcast?
But no, this is really fascinating. You're obviously a wealth of knowledge about this stuff, and it's something that's so very important and so very timely. So that's good. But that's actually not why we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes. The reason we invited you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes is to answer two questions. And the first one is this. If you could choose to have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would you choose?
Hands down, the sandwich. There are two things that I am competent to make when it comes to food: salads and sandwiches. I love making a good sandwich. So any day, I just had one for lunch myself. It was fantastic. Sandwich.
There we go. So what kind of sandwich? So the next question is usually, where should I go in Dayton to get a sandwich? But if you prefer to tell me about your lunch sandwich, that's fine too. Let's just go deep on Sandoz here.
You want me to? I can.
Yeah.
All right. So you toast the bread, put the lunch meat on, and then you dice, cucumbers, onions, and serrano peppers, olive oil and vinegar, some lettuce, kale is even better if you can get it. Melt some cheese on it, put it in the microwave for a minute, and then you put hummus on the top piece of bread.
What?
Cut it in half. It's fantastic.
It sounds like salad in sandwich form. Delicious.
So really, I make one meal, except one of them I put in between bread. Two pieces of toasted bread. That's my secret. I like that.
Well, that's really awesome.
You got me thinking now, Meg. I think you're right about
that. That's good. And then the second question is, we like to leave our listeners with like one piece of life advice. It can be big or small, serious or silly. But what is something we like to give people something to ruminate on? So if you had to give a piece of life advice, what would that be?
I would say, on a serious note, it's really hard to keep up with the news right now, and I struggle with myself, even though I have a deep interest in it, of course, and I'm talking to students and others about what's going on. But one thing that I find is actually most helpful in understanding current events is history. You hear people talk about, reading history books, or I should know more history, or making historical allusions that they often can't back up. just so often struck by, as much as I'm coming from a political science standpoint and doing quantitative analysis in a lot of these cases, as I was describing, a lot of times if you want to understand current events, read more history. There are so many things that you think are just unique to the era you live in, and actually there's just different versions of things that have happened before. We could take populism, for instance, which of course is front and center right now. I read a book on populism a couple of years ago. It was written in the 90s. I was amazed by how much the words of folks like Pat Buchanan, you could just insert into today. Or another book I was reading about Spiro Agnew, a vice president, fantastic book that came out a year or so ago from the University of Virginia Press about him. And, the things he was saying sound much like what you hear in politics today. So much that we think is new isn't actually new. I don't know if that's reassuring to think, hey, we got through it before, we can do it again, or if it's depressing to think how much some things don't change. But that perspective is one that I think is important for all of us to have.
That sounds really wonderful. Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, where can people go to find out more about your work? Is there a social media thing you'd like to direct people to, a website? Obviously, go buy the book. We'll link to that in our show notes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That'd be great. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Prof Devine, ProfDevine, and you can go to my website. It's ChristopherJDevine.com, ChristopherJDevine.com.
All right, and we will link to all of those in the show notes. Yes, plug away. What else?
Great. Yeah. That's it. I hope that helps, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on here. Megan, Stuart, this has been fun, and hey, let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Open invitation. All right. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Well, that was really interesting. In another life, I think I would be a politics junkie, but my life is not empty right now. So I'm glad to get, a real expert on there to come and give us the quick and dirty version of it. That was awesome.
For sure. I was super surprised that people specialize in studying the vice presidents.
Yeah, but I understand how now because I did know the bucket of worm spit. So the real quote, you can look it up. I'm not going to link to it. We're a government organization. It's not spit. It's a different liquid. So I knew that quote. And I can say it was really interesting, but also, and we didn't get into this, it's actually applied research in a way in terms of thinking about how to pick vice presidential candidates and stuff
fancy.
Like that. Yeah, and it was interesting to hear about how, because the Midwest is always important. It's always, last time it was, Wisconsin was a big turning point. Michigan always is, and you hear about Ohio and all that. And so I really enjoyed getting a chance to hear some of the details behind that. So that was great. That was good. Plus, a good sounding sandwich. So I'm going to check it out.
It sounded delicious.
Yeah, much better. I was going to make a sandwich for lunch, and I ended up having chili instead because we had leftovers. And, I am the leftover vacuum in our house. But now I am full of anger that I didn't make a sandwich instead.
Would it have been as delicious as his sandwich sounded, though?
No, definitely not. I can't make I can't make a sandwich to save my life. I'm not a chef at all. I am more of an appreciator of other chefs, I think. Anyway, great. Well, Megan, where can people go to find out more about the work that you're doing, both personally and with the Familiar Faces Project?
You can find me on Twitter at _TFFP and on Instagram at the Familiar Faces Project.
There you go. Wait a minute. Actually, hold on now. Hold on. Let's talk. So you just had this big deal on. So I quit. So the one thing I did for my own mental health is I logged out of social media until after this election because I feel like it's a relatively stressful time, and especially with the pandemic and the election, I'm like a doom scrolling machine. Like my fingers all decrepit, and I'm just full of anger and depression. So I logged off. But as I was logging off, I saw this really cool thing you were doing with some of your colleagues, I guess, on communication. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So we I guess. Starting back in May with Chris Cooper, the Central Park birder, there sparked a series of Black in X groups. And so that was Black Birders Week is the one that really got kicked off. Black in Nature was one of the main hashtags in that one. And there was a group that was going around asking for volunteers to participate for Black in Science communication. And so you can go on Twitter. We were mainly on Twitter, hashtag Black in SciComm. And we had a whole week full of amazing things. We had workshops and and panels. One of the things that I led was an outreach day. And so we had 3 different scientists come on, and one did a lot of different lab safety and terminology things. And then we had one do the foam gnome project and talked about chemical reactions and physical properties. And then we had what was near and dear to my heart from the College of Agriculture, food science was represented. So we talked about food properties and different activities that kids could do at home. And so that was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, I encourage you to look down right now at your phone, and right there at the bottom of the show notes, you'll see a link both to Megan's social stuff, but also to the, what is it, Black in SciComm?
blackinscicom.com.
Oh, there's a website too.
There's also a website. So you can also go into the website and you can find different Black and science you can find different Black science communicators on this website. And there, I mean, science communication revolves around all kinds of different fields, right? So I've got the natural resources background. There were people from the medical field and people that are in humanities and just all kinds of different venues. And so it was a lot of fun.
Well, that's really cool. I'm at the website now. It's Black and SciComm with 2 M's.
Yeah.
SciComm with 2 M's for communication. Well, I encourage everybody to go and check that out, and hopefully we'll have more about that in a future episode. I also encourage people to go and check out Illinois Indiana Sea Grant at iiseagrant.org, and we're on many social things at ILIN Sea Grant for Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. And so that's going to do it for the first quadrennial Teach Me About the Great Lakes election special. And so, folks, I want to remind you, special that we get to do this, that we get to vote. There are places that don't, and for many, many years, people did not. And so it's easy to get in this mindset that your vote isn't important or it doesn't count. But I think it's really important to go out there and vote. And so to celebrate that and honor that, I'm going to read from President Abraham Lincoln's concluding remarks from his message to Congress on December 1st, 1862. This is a month before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and he wanted to deliver a message to Congress. And so this is from the end of it. But first, if we're going to go maudlin, let's go full maudlin. Much better. We can succeed only by concert. It is not, can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. So go out there and vote. It really matters.